Welcome to the Howzit.ca podcast, where we share insightful stories and advice aimed at helping South Africans settle, explore, and succeed in Canada.
In our previous podcast, Simeon, we looked at the origins of a cover letter and a structure. And so today we want to go through the nitty-gritty of a cover letter, what the contents of a cover letter should be. Mm-hmm. So let me start with asking you, Simeon, what would your recommendation be on the structure of an effective cover letter?
Yeah, as we briefly mentioned in our last podcast, the structure of a cover letter really needs to be addressing, again, the writer, right? So if you treat the cover letter as, a letter that you write to someone that you know, you're responding to a request from them. So the structure we talked about last time was, 5 paragraphs. The first and the last ones being shorter. They're sort of the introduction at the beginning, and sort of the final, nail in the coffin kind of thing at the very end to kind of say, I'm the person for this role. The middle 3 paragraphs are intended to kind of give examples of 3 skills or 3, specific roles that you did, and to highlight your strengths, right? And some of the things that you've learned as well throughout the course of your career. So tactically speaking, it's about 5 paragraphs. Again, not extremely long, but it sounds long, but it doesn't need to be. From a content perspective, treat the cover letter as a response to something, right? And so we can talk a little bit about what exactly are we responding to, and that goes into the content as well, if you like.
Okay, great. So in terms of the paragraphs that you're chatting about and things that you've learned, have you got a practical example of how that could be applied?
Yeah, certainly. And keep in mind, this does depend on the seniority of the role that you're applying for. So I'll give you 2 examples. I'll give you one of a new graduate coming out of college or university. Whether you're in South Africa or Canada, it's the same thing, where there's some basic skills that you need to have. So for someone who's coming to apply for an analyst or a junior associate position, you'd want to have basic things like analytics, right? So the first of the 3 paragraphs that you talk about your skills, you might be analytics. So I've had experience in analytics, using Excel spreadsheets or databases to be able to input data and generate some reports, right? That's the first thing. Second paragraph for an analyst might be, I've got some basic communication skills. I've put together some PowerPoint presentations. I've assisted in collecting and gathering and developing materials for communication to the board, right? Or to the senior leadership. That's the second one. The third one might be teamwork, right? And that's a big one. And where you may not have had experience when you're more junior, you can use things like your volunteer experience. And, wherever you can show examples of teamwork. So maybe you have led a summer camp somewhere and you've, led 40, 50 kids. It's perfectly legitimate to put that even in a corporate resume, because you're demonstrating leadership. You're demonstrating the fact that you had to work with other camp counselors, and you've, had to work in a team and develop a curriculum. So, a junior person might have those 3 things: analytics, communications, and teamwork. If you're more senior, a good example is a recent client that I had where he was extremely involved with project management. So he would take projects and run them through 6 months and make sure that they happened, right? So I had to work with my client to figure out, well, what skills do we want to highlight? Because there's so many things that's involved with planning and execution. And so, we said, here are the 3 skills that you want to talk about. Number 1 is, being able to develop a roadmap. And what a roadmap basically is if I'm trying to plan, let's say, wedding planning, right? I want to get between now and 9 months from now, I'm getting married. Putting a timeline together is to say, well, by 3 months, here's a milestone, 6 months, here's second milestones, and 9 months, we have to get married. So that's something that he was good at. And so we wanted to highlight that as, timeline, roadmap development. Here's how we get from A to B. The second area, it was talking about upward management. So this project manager was very senior. He reported directly to, senior VPs and, CEOs, etc. So being able to manage upwards was something that we highlighted, saying, here's some examples of where, he was asked to do something under a lot of pressure, and he had to manage the expectations of his senior leadership. And whether it was gathering them together in a huddle and planning forward or whatever it was, that was the second element, right? So first was roadmap, timeline. Second was around upward management. And third really was around change management. And what that is in a lot of companies, whether it's public sector or private sector, is once you do something to an organization, there's change that happens. And so you have to manage that change to make sure that there's adherence to it and things don't fall back. So he had examples of where, he was successful in the past of maintaining change. So, that's a good example. A recent client who is very senior, and we need to kind of pick and choose, but be very clear about 3 skills that he wants to highlight that is in response to a job description, that this is what they're looking for.
So how would you typically, if you look at those 3 skills, would you look at the position that you're applying for, and you would say highlight 3 of those skills and see which ones would fit best, and then put those 3 forward? Is that how you would look at that?
Yeah, I would certainly do that. And just a very quick background about cover letters. We talked a little bit about last time about Leonardo da Vinci being the first person documented to write a CV or a cover letter. Somewhere between then and 1950s, there was a disappearance of cover letters. And it was only when unions started to form, a unionized environment, that people start to have very specific requirements. And for whatever reason, this is what happens. 1956 is documentation of the very first detailed job description that required a cover letter. And what that basically was, I'll read this to you very quickly, but this company, this grocer in 1956 was looking for, a sales manager with outstanding administrative and leadership talents, should be willing to relocate anywhere in the US, right? And it says submit complete resume and appropriate cover letter. And this is the first documented evidence in 1900s of something that required a cover letter. So what they were looking for was they needed you to write a letter that would address those specific things. So when you're writing a cover letter, you have to make sure that it's customized to what their requirements are. If a recruiter is looking for someone who's had administrative experience, you can't shoot them a general cover letter that has all kinds of stuff on it. You have to specifically address what they're looking for. So give examples of where you've had to demonstrate those skills, and give examples of where you've had to come across a lot of challenges in doing that job. How did you overcome it? What resources did you use? So again, the content has to be directly addressing to what is in the job posting. So, they've asked a question, answer it precisely. So I'm not a big proponent of sort of shooting out a generic cover letter. I don't believe also in customizing cover letter for every single posting that you apply to. But I think the ones that you are interested in, you do have to read specifically for what they're looking for and respond with, evidences, kind of examples of where you've excelled in those areas that they're looking for.
I think it would definitely, the effort of doing and customizing that cover letter would show in your example of what you've done with the cover letter. It will show your experience. So the effort versus the output of that would definitely show if you've taken the time to understand and explain to them how you would fit into that role and what would make you different.
Yeah. Keep in mind that, again, going back to the concept of your resume being the highlight reel, is what really draws recruiters' attention in a resume are numbers. They want to see metrics. They want to see how things have improved, how efficiency has gone up. The highlight of a cover letter is the storyline. So you should include the metrics that are there. In other words, you say, well, I increased sales by 45%. Okay, well, the context behind that was despite the fact that the rest of the organization, the sales went down by 5%. Wow. That's a big difference. You can't put that in your resume. There's no space for that. But your cover letter gives you that story behind the highlight. So again, it's an opportunity for you to shine. So
that brings me to the next question, because a cover letter can go on and on. What is the typical length of a cover letter? We can tell stories till the cows come home one day.
Yeah. And that's a great question, Mel. I have a problem with that. I have a problem with too many words. I have to cull it down. So here's the deal. Cover letter shouldn't be more than one page. Certainly, I know some people in some countries, they will tend to go on and on, not intentionally, but that's just the way it is. But one letter, one page is really the optimal. Anything more than that, people don't really pay attention to. My general rule about the paragraphs is the first paragraph being an intro is really a 2 or 3 sentence, very short acknowledgement of here's what I'm going to do. I'm applying in response to a role that you've put into XYZ. Okay. So maybe 2, 3 sentences. Each of the next 3 sentences or 3 paragraphs about your skills should really be structured the way we talked about, which is here's the situation, complication, resolution, what you did about it, and the results. Right. So if you think about it, it's only 4 sentences, right? If you describe, here's the situation, here's what was the problem with that, and here's what I did about it, and here's the outcome. So 4 sentences for that second paragraph, third paragraph, fourth paragraph. Each one of them has basically 4 sentences, not run-on sentences, right? But very clear. And then your last paragraph is really only about 2 or 3 lines again, just saying, I'm the person for your job. Here's why that's the case, and nice and that's going to be a short but powerful cover letter.
So just building on those bases, and you can then take it from there and make sure that you stick within that one page of guideline. I think you lose people if you write more than a page, to be quite honest. So it is a good guideline to follow.
Yeah, you lose people very quickly if you start to ramble. Even in those 4 sentences in each of the 3 paragraphs with the skills. So that's why they have to be very clear and distinct, kind of, what happened, here's the situation, and here's the results at the end of it. Sort of a bit of a bookend. Each one sort of storytelling, a very short but kind of a complete, concise story about a skill that you have. Yeah.
So we did touch a lot on that, about how much detail should you provide. Do you have any recommendations within those paragraphs that you're going to be writing? Any more tips that you can share with us?
Well, be sure to sell yourself, right? Your cover letter is it's not time to be shy. And my observation about a lot of South African clients and folks who are coming over is that there tends to be a lot of modesty, right, around, and I'm not sure if it's a cultural thing. It's not just South Africa, it's also from India and China. It's sort of there's not sort of an in-your-face kind of a feeling to it. And Canadians as well, we have a problem with being extremely modest, and it's not a problem in the right context, but here's an opportunity to shine. So just make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. If you understand that you're coming up against 200 other applicants, and what's going to make you distinguished and stand out is that mentality of the drive, right? And that's going to go a long way subconsciously in how you use your words, and how you use your phrasing, and how you tell your story. And, you don't always have to attribute everything to yourself. It could be your team's contribution that you write down in the cover letter, but at the end of the day, this is a spotlight on you. So sell yourself, and make sure that you stand out in the crowd. Find your own method of doing that, different styles for different people. But remember, this is a sales pitch. The spotlight's on you now. So you've got to give it your all.
Absolutely. So I want to then ask, what are the do's and the definite don'ts that you need to do on a cover letter?
Yeah. Well, for international folks who are coming into North America, typically in cover letters, you don't want to include, personal information, right? So not so much about your personal history, like my family, grew up here and this is where I sort of cut my teeth and working here. Like geography isn't as important as skill. So your personal information around your address or your kind of where you went to high school, things like that don't really make a difference. In fact, they kind of distract away from your skills, right? Which is what's more important. You certainly want to be careful about not being too casual with your language. So at the end of the day, this is still someone who has the authority to be able to hire, right? So they're not your friend per se. So you don't want to be casual about how you word things. You still want to make sure that you're honoring and respecting that interview process, right? And at the same time, you want to be careful that you're not being too rigid. So that's the other bookend of it. Is I've seen a lot of cover letters where it's very abrupt. It's kind of like a little bit maybe even old English. Kind of very very strict and straightforward. And there's no sort of, I call it humanity. There's no sort of sense of humanness behind it. You're going to be someone with flaws, right? And I always talk about failure and the importance of learning from failure. And you need to come across as someone who is relatable. So on the one hand, you don't want to be too casual. On the other hand, you don't want to be too rigid with how you're expressing your thoughts and your skills. So in other words, let me give you an example. If you're going to talk about, increasing or improving sales, you don't want to say, I developed a marketing plan and therefore that increased sales by X%, full stop, right? That's a very rigid, it's factual. It may have happened, but you kind of want to round it off, right? You want to say, I collaborated with my team or cross-functionally to develop a marketing plan that incorporated, clients' expectations, resulted in, 45% increase in sales, and was widely acknowledged or recognized throughout the company, right? So something that is obviously not casual because it's not a coffee chat, but at the same time, it's got humanity behind that. It's you telling your story. So, those are kind of, it's a fine line. I also will say one more thing is that get someone to read it from an objective perspective, a third person, to understand the job description, that they don't have to be from that industry, but also look at your response and tell you, are you answering the questions? Are you being too casual or being too rigid? And, does this read like a true letter kind of a thing?
Yeah, I've had some 2 tips that I've received and that really helped me as well. One was whatever you do, once you've typed up your cover letter and your resume for that matter, print it out so that you could read what you are writing. You sometimes miss the tips. That was the one that really stood out for me. And then get someone else to have a look at that for you and ask the question, so what? Because if you've improved it by 45%, so what? But by saying that you've included your team or you as a team member, it shows that you're a team player. So it's you're still stating the facts, but it's just rounding it off, as you say. So those tips are.
I just want to quickly mention, I don't know if I talked about this, but the applicant tracking system, I think we talked about the software that kind of siphons through resumes based on keywords. The cover letter is used more in the context of the ATS, the tracking system, than the resume is. And the reason for that is because there is context behind the keyword. So certainly include keywords. If you know that the role, needs developing or coding specific kind of technology language or any profession that's specific to that, make sure you do include that in the cover letter as you're talking about your experiences. So that's just one last thing as a tip to make sure that you understand the cover letter is really what the applicant tracking software reads a lot of, even more so than your resume.
So it's really understanding the keywords that's in that job description and making sure that they are written in the cover letter. Is that what you're saying?
Right. And sorry, one last thing is what you can do as a tip for that is take several job postings of a similar kind. So if you're looking for project management, pick out 3 or 4 of them from different industries, and you can use word clouds. So there's software online where you can melt them together, and what they'll do is they'll tell you the frequency of words that appear. And that's one of the things that I put out in one of the courses, that you want to reverse engineer that, because the ATS is reading the number of times you say the word communication, right? So you want to reverse engineer that and look at examples of that job description and see how many times the job description points out a word. So if they say a lot about communication, you've put 3 job descriptions through a word cloud, it collaborates and tells you how well you need to include communication in your cover letter, right? So anyway, these kinds of interesting, trade tips.
Absolutely, and that's what makes the difference in your resume standing out from the rest, and that the ATS can pick that up.
That's right.
And give you that chance. That's really great advice. Thanks, Simeon.
No problem.
That is the interesting thing is, as a South African, I think the recruitment process is different. And one of the challenges that we face is exactly that. When you start talking about ATS and word clouds and things like that, it's the terminology that goes behind it that we don't always understand. Mm. Can you take us through some of the terminology, some of the things that you've seen people are struggling with, and just maybe we might call it by a different name, but in Canada it's very specific. Have you got some tips around that?
Well, several come to mind in recent days. So, and they're going to be a little bit industry specific. So bear with me. One is a client of mine used district as a term, and she actually kept using that over and over again. And I needed to understand what that meant. Well, district in the sense of retail really means department, right? So these are kind of things that you wouldn't know because in the context of where you're coming from, that's what it's called. In the context of North America, you wouldn't know that. So district meant department. So you clarified that. There's other buzzwords like, project management sometimes is called, project mapping, right? Or something, or milestones here would be called, stake, what do they call it? Stake in the ground or something like that. So terminology that's used widely that talk about kind of different pieces of something like a project plan is called something different in South Africa versus here. So, terminology is important, but I think that's difficult to, that's helpful if you have someone in Canada who kind of understands the industries here, who can kind of do the translation for you. And so, and also significant. So I had a client this morning who was in construction and construction development, and he spoke a lot about, needing to survey certain sites and be able to finance. And he was talking about all the mechanisms involved with construction. But here it's a lot simpler than that. And there's different kind of roles for what he was talking about. A surveyor is a surveyor here, right? That's an actual profession. And in South Africa, it might be clumped together with a larger process. So again, these sorts of things, okay, well, you ask them, well, specifically, are you looking for a surveyor job or are you looking for something else? And if you're looking for something that includes everything, well, I got to tell you that maybe there doesn't really exist that kind of a role in Canada. So, that may not be terminology, but that's sort of a way of thinking about how businesses run. Context is key, as they say, and content sort of can be corrected, but just, you just need to talk to someone who understands the Canadian market.
Yeah, it's the same as the challenges that you look at, and that's why you need to do some research around the positions. When it's, and as an example, when you have a look at what partner means in Canada versus what partner means in South Africa, the same with director, it's got a very different meaning. So when you start looking for positions and you start on the Glassdoors and all the Indeed, those job site searches, you'll find that if you are looking for the exact same job description than what you've got in South Africa, it's called something very different here. So you might not find what you're looking for. And it's not that position is not available here. It's just called something very different. So you need to understand the industry and take some time to research it, to find out where would you fit in. It's not that the position might not be there. It might just be called something else.
Yeah, and sometimes you need human clarification, right? So I had another client who on his resume he spoke of himself as an executive assistant. Okay, which is very interesting because an executive assistant in Canada is someone who works alongside, a leader and helps them to set their calendars and book meetings and, find people and resources. But actually what he was an operations manager. He actually ran plants back in South Africa. He ran large plants. And so he did so much more than administrative roles. And as we were talking about it, it's like, oh, you're not an executive assistant. You need to brand yourself as an operations manager, because then you're going to get jobs and job postings that are relevant to you. If you send your resume out and cover letter out as a executive assistant to a role that requires an operations manager, they're not going to hire you because you're not even identified as the same person. Yeah. So, I mean, human input is good. I mean, that's why sort of all of us here are involved with coaching, is because we provide that context that helps, folks succeed.
Absolutely. And I think that must have really opened up a different world for your client.
Yes.
From that perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's great. So I want to end off with the same question I asked you last time, Simeon, but in the context of what we're chatting around, the contents of a cover letter, what is the overarching advice that you would give away in terms of the one important thing about a cover letter, the contents?
Yeah, I would say sell yourself. Yeah. Use the cover letter as this is your marketing tool. This is, if you were to pay $1 million, to put a poster up on the side of a highway, this is what you would invest in. You've got to put your all into it. Now, you're either not going to include one, which has a separate philosophy. But if you do include one, sell yourself and sell yourself hard. And it doesn't mean you need to be aggressive, but you need to be ambitious, right? So people can feel that by the way you write. And as long as you keep that mindset, that selling yourself mindset, you're gonna do fine.
That's great advice. Thanks so much for that. So that's all for today's episode of the Howzit.ca podcast. Thanks for listening, and thank you again, Simeon, for joining us. This is a great session around your cover letters and resume, and we look forward for the rest of the sessions that we'll be doing in the future.
Great. Thank you.
This episode of the Howzit.ca podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more casual conversations, success stories, and advice to South Africans in Canada.